And I want to especially thank General Luby for being here and for all of the important work that he is doing for our troops, and Jim McIntyre, who is the chaplain of the Vermont National Guard, but also the coordinator of the Vermont National Guard outreach program. So I want to thank both of them for being here on short notice. We are delighted today to announce that Congress has recently approved, at my request, a $3 million grant for the Vermont National Guard to continue and expand its vitally important outreach program for Vermont's returning Iraq and Afghanistan service members and their families. This funding will enable us to do everything that we can to reach out to National Guard and Reserve members and their families to receive the help that they need as they readjust and transition back to life at home. At a time when returning soldiers across this country are suffering from record-breaking levels of PTSD and traumatic brain injury, these funds should play an extremely important role. And I also at this moment want to thank Senator Leahy for the help that he has given us in making sure that this legislation stayed alive as it moved through the Congress. Let me just very briefly discuss the problem that we're talking about and some of the staggering numbers that we're looking at. According to the Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA, the number of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who experienced PTSD increased by 70%, or by 20,000 cases, during the last fiscal year. The Defense Department's Task Force on Mental Health reported that it found 38% of soldiers and 31% of Marines report psychological concerns such as traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder after returning from deployment. Among members, and here's the important figure for our state, among members of the National Guard, the figure is much higher, 49%, with numbers expected to grow because of repeated deployments. So let me repeat that. But the numbers tell us that some 49% of returning members of the National Guard are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, or TBI. Another report from the Department of Veterans Affairs says that, quote, over 52,000 veterans who fought in Iraq or Afghanistan and are now home have been treated or evaluated for PTSD by the department. Another issue that we have to deal with. And this just talks about the costs of war that sometimes we don't see. A CBS News investigation released just last week found that, quote, in 2005, in 45 states they looked at, there were at least 6,256 suicides among those who served in the armed forces. That's 120 each and every week in just 1 year. An analysis of war numbers obtained from states for 2004 and 2005 found that veterans were more than twice as likely to commit suicide in 2005 than non-vets. One age group stands out: veterans aged 20 through 24. Those who have served during the war in Iraq had the highest suicide rate among all veterans, estimated between 2 and 4 times higher than civilians the same age. 2 signature injuries from Iraq and Afghanistan are PTSD and traumatic brain injury. Some of our soldiers returning have one or the other, and sometimes a soldier may have both. Many of these injuries are invisible from the outside. What makes this issue so hard is this is not an amputation, this is not blindness, this is not loss of hearing. Somebody can be walking down the street and appear to be very, very normal, and yet that person is suffering some very serious problems, unable to sleep, anxiety attacks, panic attacks, turning to alcohol, turning to drugs, suicidal thoughts, not able to hold a job, not able to continue a relationship with a wife or kids. That's what tens of thousands of our soldiers are experiencing, and we have got to be cognizant of that. A report released just last week and summarized by the Washington Post says, soldiers who have served in Iraq are suffering substantially greater mental distress several months after leaving the combat zone than when they first return home. with 1 out of 5 active duty Army soldiers and more than 40% of Army reservists needing treatment. In other words, what is happening is somebody comes home and the euphoria of coming home is one thing, and then suddenly we find 2 or 3 months that person is seeing some serious problems. So what does all of this mean? It means that, among other things, we have got to learn from Vietnam. And General Doobie and I were just discussing this a moment ago. I think everyone acknowledges that the way we treated returning veterans from Vietnam was absolutely inadequate. These guys came back, we said goodbye, have a nice life, and some of them are homeless today. Some of them committed suicide. Some of them were unable to maintain jobs. We learned something from that. What we are trying to do in this program is something a little bit different than is going on around the rest of the country. And that is what we are saying is that, first of all, of course, through the VA, through the Veterans Administration, and through other programs, we have got to have the best quality service available for our veterans and their families. These are problems that impact wives. These are problems that impact kids. That goes without saying. But what we are also saying is that the best services in the world don't mean anything if people are not able to access those services. So what we're trying to do here in Vermont is kind of think outside of the box. How do we make sure that everybody who is hurting takes advantage of the services and the programs that are available? And that's what an outreach program is about. And one of the symptoms of PTSD or TBI is that people are not necessarily lining up at the door of the services. How do you access? How do you make people feel comfortable about coming in the door? That's not so easy, by the way. And we're going to be learning as we go along. We don't have the answers here today. These guys don't have the answers. But we are probably doing as much as any other state in the country, and other states will learn from our example. And that's what this is about. And we welcome any ideas that people throughout our state have. This is a statewide problem. Every community in the state experiences. All of us have got to work together to reintegrate those soldiers back into their communities and so forth. I should also mention that as part of the same process, well, we obtained $3 million for the state of Vermont. We also obtained another $3 million for the rest of the country. There will be different states jumping into this outreach concept. But this state, I think, will lead the effort, and what we do here will be, I think, an example and a model for other states as well. I want to thank both General Doobie and Jim McIntyre for their just decency and their hard work over the last year, understanding the seriousness of this problem and stepping up to the plate to address it. Let me just give the mic over to General Doobie.
Thank you, and I'd just like to say, Senator Sanders, your leadership on this issue is greatly appreciated by the National Guard and the families. And the assistance that Senator Leahy's office has given is also greatly appreciated. We've talked about PTSD and mild traumatic brain injury and moderate MTBI, but the other issues we're dealing with are family conflicts, job conflicts, depression. All the studies indicate that early intervention is key, and I think it's apropos that you brought up the Vietnam veteran. What we're trying to do is get out early enough, intervene with the people who are having a difficult time adjusting back into society, back into their units, back into their families, in an effort to have them to be fully functioning members of society again. And the majority of our people are doing fine, but the statistics, particularly the national studies, indicate that we're talking about potential of hundreds of Vermonters who have served that may be having problems. The metrics are still being developed locally, and Chaplain McIntyre can address the specifics of that. But what we have found is, across the board, our people are very happy, enthusiastic that someone is actually asking how they're doing. What we're trying to do is make sure that we lend as much assistance as possible to our people and let them know that if they are having issues, that we want to deal with the issues early and be persistent. I know that I've relayed this before, but we had a soldier who got off the airplane down at Camp Shelby. He came back from Iraq, from Ramadi, Iraq, and I said to him, you know, we're going to be here for you. And he said, sir, are you going to be here 2 years from now for me? Are you going to be here 10 years for me? And I told him we would. And I think that what we're trying to do is let people know that the conflict that is going on today is different than we've ever dealt with before. And the only way we're going to be able to take care of our families and our communities and our employers is to have people who adjust back in what we call the new normal. And the new normal is different for different people. But when people come back, it is different. And we want to do everything we can to help them, to assist them in their transition back to be back home.
Thanks very much. Jim McIntyre is not only the chaplain for the Vermont National Guard, he's the coordinator of the Vermont National Guard Outreach Program. Jim, thank you for what you're doing, and thanks for being here this morning.
Well, thank you, Senator Sanders, and I guess what I would add to what General Dubey said, and you said, this is so very intensely personal in what's happening, because it strikes right at the heart of our families and our communities. The wonderful thing about this outreach program is that it is working. I'd like to share a couple things that I see personally over the last 7 months and how it's working, and why it's so good to see that we've got the added resources that we can hopefully add some team members. Number one, I want to mention that the importance of referrals into our team. It's so important to help get referrals in. We're charged with contacting, every soldier who's been deployed. Now, there's about 2,662, give or take a couple that might have slipped through the bureaucratic paper cracks. But between the records at the Vermont, the Governor's Veterans Council with Clayton Clark, and our National Guard records, we know that between the National Guard and the reservists, which are your Army, Navy, Coast Guard, Air Force, all the rest in Vermont, we have a list that we can contact. Now, 2,662 people is a lot of people to contact. So getting referrals in from family, they're coming in from family, they're coming in from grandparents and parents, they're coming in from neighbors, they're coming in from the command staff. Our command staff has been wonderful in supervising their people, and I'll get a call and say, Jim, can you be in touch with so-and-so? They're having a rough time. So those are increasing. You as a press can help immensely by letting people know that we have one number that comes in, 338-3364, that's 802, that will get somebody who has a referral to get into our office, and then we can go from there. The coordination with the VA. This has been a wonderful story, and I say it as one of the oldest of 5 sons who were in Vietnam. I got a call in 1972 from my mother. She said, Jim, your brother just came back from Vietnam. Can he come and live with you for a year? We had a family who could take, somebody in, and they all served in Southeast Asia. Well, families are doing their share, but a lot of families are not in shape to take care of some people who have serious problems, particularly if the families are split up, and they're having a hard time keeping that family together. So we're fortunate we have the VA and all the family program agencies in place that if somebody's got a mental health problem, we can easily get them into somebody. Give you an example. We have now a substance abuse person who has come in at the Colchester VA, Julia Rice. So we had one of our team members had a call from a guard supervisor, said this person's having problems in this area. They want to talk. The soldier needed help. So last week, Glenn Riley, our outreach worker up in Enosburg Falls, getting ready for something else because he'd already put 50 hours in this week. He took the call, and it ended up being taking the soldier to the Colchester VA. They met with Dr. Upton, with Julia Rice, the substance abuse person, and he ended up taking that person to the VA in White River Junction. And then soldier was willing to stay overnight. Now, it doesn't always work that smoothly, but it's working more smoothly like that more often, and the people are in place that can help that soldier. So part of our job is to identify some of the problems, help to get them to, if they haven't applied, they've got themselves enrolled in the VA, to get them enrolled. So our team is working, one-on-one, and working one-on-one with those VA mental health counselors in Colchester, in White River Junction, and when we have had the need to, we have had to relate to people in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, because soldiers in the National Guard, some of them live in New Hampshire, in New York, in Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, and some in Maine. So this gets spread out. But those are some of the particular ways in which the team is working, and it takes a lot of people to make it work. A lot of people.
Okay, questions?
How many members of that 2,2662, I think it was your figure, can you tell us have had to get some kind of care or treatment or so forth?
Boy, that's hard. That's a hard number to come up with. Some we don't know of who went in.
About?
Well, gosh, I think we're talking, 300 to 400, at least. And that, I think we're just beginning to, as General Duby said and the Senator mentioned, we're beginning to see now the things that are coming later. The euphoria of getting home is over. The engineers, when you've been dealing with over 1,200 IEDs, the successive blasts have their effect. And Dr. Pomerantz at the VA, Dr. Friedman at the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, they are helping immensely with helping identify these kind of things and symptoms. We'll get a call from a wife, and she'll say, he's irritable, or he has, or some of the soldier will call and said, after my wife finally said to me 5 times that I'm forgetting things. There's a number of short-term memory losses that people are identifying even in themselves without their spouse or a friend mentioning them. So that's about it.
1,200 IEDs was that a reference to?
Well, we have many of these guys whose job it was to clear IED. That's what they did. That's what they did. The most dangerous job in the nation. And they saved God knows how many lives in the process, but they experienced very large numbers of explosions. And what we don't know, and why I think both the General and Jim indicated, we're dealing in a whole new world of things we just don't know a whole lot about. I mean, if you were been exposed, and General, you can speak better about this than I do, but many of these guys have been exposed to multiple explosions.
Yeah.
We don't have scientific evidence to know exactly what impact an explosion a certain distance away has for you. It may not knock your brains out, may not knock your head off. That doesn't mean to say it doesn't have some impact on your brain. We don't know that. That's what we're looking at. Now, what happens if you experience that 5 times? So what happens if you see some terrible things also, and you combine PTSD along with this? What does this mean? Who knows? And that's what we're learning about. But I think what we are in agreement about is we intend to do everything that we can not to do what took place after the Vietnam War. We're going to be much more proactive, much more aggressive in addressing these problems. But, General, you know more about it than I do. So.
Well, to answer that specific question, the problem when I said this is a different kind of war than we've had before is in the past, when we're talking about PTSD, in World War I they call it shell shock. or battle fatigue, or the 1,000-yard stare. I mean, that is really what we're talking about when we're talking about PTSD. Is someone who has experienced either observing or participating or being the victim of trauma. It's not unlike other trauma that unfortunately our society experiences too much trauma, and there's significant lasting consequences to trauma. That's the one issue. The second issue, what Senator Sanders said about the IEDs and traumatic brain injury, is that we've never had so many explosions in close proximity to people. Now, here's the good news. The good news, people are living. But a lot of the reason they're living is because people like Senator Sanders has made an emphasis to the U.S. Army to buy the MRAP vehicles at a increasing rate. And the MRAP is mine-resistant ambush protected vehicle. There's a number of different vehicles that are out there that are brand new. They're called the Buffalo, the Cougar, the RG-31. These vehicles are like armored vehicles. So here's the good news. Vermonters who've been in these vehicles in close proximity to huge explosions have been protected inside the vehicle. They don't die. Here's the bad news. They're being beat up, multiple concussions. Our biggest concern with the concussions is in high school sports, most schools have a 2 or 3 concussion rule. If you have 2 or 3 concussions in high school sports, you're done. You can't play hockey or football or field hockey or whatever anymore, because you don't know what the long-term impact is of multiple concussions.
You mentioned 1,200 figure.
We'll just use that 1,200 figure. That was one unit, our 131st Engineers, who were in a battalion in Iraq that cleared 1,200 IEDs. Many of these soldiers were exposed to many concussions. We don't know what the long-term impact is. You don't know if you're inside of a vehicle and the whole vehicle is disabled by a huge bomb and you live. That's great, but what's the science of the damage to the brain is what is being researched with traumatic brain injury research. And traumatic brain injury is not necessarily new. What's new about it is it's prevalent. It can be so prevalent. That's what's new. You can have someone in a car accident or someone in a motorcycle accident, right, who has TBI. Well, the difference here is we've got a lot of people who may have TBI because of the prevalence of roadside bombs.
And then combine that, if you like, if you like going out every day, clearing these roadside bombs, not knowing whether you're going to come home alive or not. So you got the combination of dealing with explosions plus the stress involved in dealing with that, and we just don't know what that all adds up to. But it's something that we have got to find out.
And the other, just low context for the outside world, the other factor here, as you mentioned, Vietnam, the lessons of Vietnam. A lot of people that I talk to on the street have a little brain problem themselves with the fact that all these folks that went, who sent there in harm's way, who died, who were going through this suffering, were for reasons that were not true. The causes of the war, the weapons of mass destruction. Unfortunately, the guy didn't have weapons of mass destruction or connection to 9/11. That's a problem in the brains of a lot of people here in Vermont, as you know. And what do you say about that?
Well, Peter, I'm sorry.
Can I say something?
Sure, please.
Peter, instead of, I would say that I get your point, but I would say I think a more important question should be, and a more important way to look at that subject is, we have an awful lot of people who are in the National Guard who never really anticipated they'd be deployed to Iraq. Now, regardless of the WMD question, I would say that's less of a factor than the issue of there's an awful lot of people who we didn't realize as a country that the National Guard and the reserves have always been known in the construct of being a reserve force, a strategic reserve force. There's no other way to describe what's happening today than to call the National Guard and the reserves an operational reserve. We're like everyone else. Our people go to Iraq or Afghanistan and do everything that the full-time military, the active duty military does. And so I think that's a more, as a country, how long are we going to do that? Now, the idea of how we got there, I think that has less impact on the soldier or the airman who's just going out and doing their job versus the fact that some of these people didn't really think they would be there.
Wait, okay, say something.
You can't say anything unless you have the machine. You can say it, but nobody will hear you, Jim.
Okay, General Dewey has and others have often said, we're dealing with a citizen soldier. Okay, even though we're functioning like a full-time military outfit, citizen soldier is more willing to talk about what's going on in the world than sometimes people who are in the military full-time. You get a bunch of our National Guard people together in families or in groups, and they'll give you the cross-section of how they feel about what's going on. One of the things that I think we need to capture from this group is that we've got some citizens. General Washington said, the first 1,000 employees of our national government had to have fought in the Revolution. I think he was tying into some people who understood a lot of the values that we hold dear, even though sometimes they're not doing, and going places that they feel really good about. But we've got a whole bunch of people who are very sensitive to their citizenship, and will be very important for where we go in the future. But it's across. You get a group. It's across the board in how people feel.
Sure.
And raise those questions.
Right. I think people know my feelings about the law. I voted against it, and I want to bring our troops home as soon as we can. But what we're dealing with today is Jim just indicated. Some of these people who went over, they didn't believe in the war. Some of them did believe in the war. But the reality is, right now, you got people from the state of Vermont throughout this country, good, decent people who did what they were asked to do. They're in trouble right now, and we cannot turn our backs on them. We have to be very proactive and do everything we can to reintegrate them into their communities and to make sure that their families are doing as well as possible. And that's what we're talking about.
General Dewey, speaking of these citizen soldiers, some of them have been deployed twice who may not have expected that they would end up in a war zone like this. And if 50% of them are suffering from these invisible wounds, have we redeployed veterans who had suffered this the first time around, and we compounded this issue by putting them back in harm's way?
I would tell you that everyone who goes a second time, let me be clear, Darren. Everyone who volunteers, if they volunteer to go a second time, then it's a case-by-case basis, and they get signed by me. I have to approve every member of the Vermont National Guard who volunteers to go a second or a third time. And we have had members who have volunteered. Most of the people who volunteer for the multiple tours have been Afghanistan. And I would tell you that, generally speaking, people feel there's a different sense about the Afghanistan. You know what I mean? They have to be recommended by their chain of command to me to go again. And anyone that we identify that we suspect have some of the issues that we're talking about, we don't want them going. We won't let them go. But Senator Sanders, I think, said it most eloquently. These are often invisible wounds. So you don't always know what the issues are. But I will tell you, if we know someone has PTSD or traumatic brain injury, we're not going to allow them to go over, because it will exacerbate. The experts say that this can build on itself, and that's what's so key about early intervention. Because if you intervene early and you deal with some of these mental health issues, you can overcome the issues, and then you can continue to be a functioning member of the National Guard and in your community, in your family, and that's our goal, right, sir? I mean,
Absolutely.
the goal is to give anyone help they need, so they can continue to live their life just the way they want to live their life.
How many
And
Vermont
let me
guards-
just add something. And by the way, we're focusing on those people who are hurting. There are a lot of people going to come home and amazing.
Doing great.
They're going to amazing. They're going to come home and they're going to do just fine. And we don't know why. Something impacts one person and the other. So.
Right.
How many Vermont guards people in the war zone today?
About 82. Well, around 80, I'll say, Peter.
Okay.
Around 80.
And this is Iraq and Afghanistan?
Right. Iraq, Afghanistan, Kuwait. We've got some people in Kyrgyzstan. We've got.
That's not a lot of people, really. is it?
No, it's the smallest number of people we've had in 5 years.
Wow.
So we're very happy of where we are right now in the deployment schedule.
Any plans for upping that you're aware of at the moment?
I will tell you that we are planning for the future. We do not have a hard deployment date. If we do get alerted, we will be publicly announcing that. I think it's pretty obvious that this is a long war, and that we expect that we will be going back in large numbers, and we are preparing to go back in large numbers. God willing, we won't, but we have to prepare that that's the case.
When you're saying large numbers, that's like 1,500. Is that large numbers or hundreds or?
I would say
Well, it's going to be impossible to estimate.
And you would have to personally approve what each and every one who in that large deployment who will be going a second time?
no. When Darren asked that question, it was basically the second deployment or third deployment, and that would be a volunteer deployment. If we were alerted in the future that Vermont was going in large numbers as units, then everyone would be going from the unit, but there would be an evaluation of every person to make sure that they're capable of going.
So you would or would not be signing off on individuals within that unit who had been before or whether they could go again?
I would just say that it would be, we would still ensure that people who shouldn't be going back wouldn't be going back, but it would be a different process than the way we're doing it right now. Because right now, the people who volunteer, so it's one or two people, it's a whole different, it's an easier process.
Okay, we've got a meeting next door actually.
Anything you're doing for Thanksgiving?
Eating turkey.
Anything you would like to tell the people of Vermont they should be thankful for? The two major TV stations are here.
Well,
I don't know if he's thankful for that.
Well,
we should.
What's to be thankful for this year? Because a lot of people are feeling a little depressed. Some people.
Well, I'm a little bit prejudiced and a little bit chauvinistic, but I happen to believe that we live in a great state, and certainly not just from a physical perspective, but that we are a small state. And I think what you're seeing today is that people come together in a sense of community, trying to reach out and help people, whether it's veterans people. We recently read in the papers that many of the homeless, many of the food shelves were lacking food, and suddenly people responded to that. So what our state at its best is about is making sure that people are not left behind, and that we reach out as one human being to another. And I love the state, I'm proud of it, and I think we should all be proud of what we're doing.
Is the war going better? Some say it is. Do you think it is?
Yeah, I think it is. I think the surge has been working. If you look at the metrics, the surge seems to be working.
Senator?
The casualty rates are down, the amount of violence is down, but the goal of the surge was to bring about political reconciliation. That's the goal, not to keep our troops in Iraq indefinitely. That apparently does not seem to be happening. And while our troops in very large numbers are in Iraq, the situation in Afghanistan is not good. There appears to be a resurgence of the Taliban, and more casualties there, more violence there. Pakistan is obviously a situation we worry about. We worry about the growth of Al-Qaeda all over the world. So, is violence down in Iraq? Yes, it is, and that's great. And casualty rates are down, but it's a long story. But as I have said many, many times, I think we need a new direction to defeat international terrorism. I want to see our troops home as soon as possible. Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you.